I'm Yann Martel, the author of Life of Pi, The High Mountains of Portugal, and Self, and I'm delighted to be a judge for the next big story from the Novelry. If you have a problem, that usually leads to plot. And the fact the two, I think, are closely related. It'd be funny to have a story with absolutely no problems that yet has a good plot. And at the same time, it'd be funny to have a story that has a huge problem but no plot. Now, plot, I think, is something that you have to think about carefully, because I think some writers, especially emergent writers, perhaps overemphasize plot. Yes, of course, something has to happen in a story. You have to have some kind of story. In fact, sometimes plot and story are sort of somewhat synonymous, but there's a problem with too much plot. And you will see that in any number of Netflix series, let's say, where the production is great and the plot is really appealing, but at the end of it, somehow you forget it. A week later, you've completely forgotten what it was about. And that often happens when a story is too plot driven. You know, a story in which someone can escape a room, then they escape it, but then they can't escape the building, and then they can't escape the city, and then they can't escape the country. You know, if it's just problems and overcoming that problem, obstacle, and they're overcoming constantly, and you can do that very cleverly with all kinds of obstacles, at one point it becomes tiresome. It is nothing but that. Ultimately, in a story, that to me the most satisfying kind of story is one where yes, obviously there has to be some sort of plot, but you also have to have something that feeds your mind. And that's not necessarily plot. A plot will feed your heart. You want your heart to go pitter-patter, to beat a little bit faster in a story. But not just that, because that's like eating candy. It tastes really good, but there's no nourishment to it. Nourishment in a story doesn't necessarily come from plot. It comes from the result of plot. What do you learn? What does the character learn from the plot, from the problem? How do they grow? How do they change? What does it all mean? You want something more memorable. A perfect example, if you want, of a story that perfectly balanced plot with non-plot, with thematic concerns, intellectual concerns, is Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. It's a short little novella, 80 pages. One morning, Gregor Samsa wakes up and he's an enormous beetle. He is literally being transformed, metamorphosized into an enormous beetle. So there you see the bit of a plot there. You have a character who changes radically, repels the other characters in the story. There you have your plot. But what's lovely about Metamorphosis is that it's also about it comes down to identity. What does it mean to be you, to be me? What does it mean to be oneself? How do others interpret us? How do we live with each other? The story is about a story. There is a story in there. Things happen, but it's just as much about what does it mean. And to have something mean something, you don't need to have frenetic action. So Metamorphosis is a perfect example of the two being nicely balanced. Yes, there is plot, but not too much. Otherwise, it becomes forgettable. But there's also intellectual concerns, but not too many, because otherwise it gets boring. There's no reason to read a boring story. The plot developed in Life of Pi incrementally, in part as a result of research. That's another thing I do a lot of when I write my books. It's a lovely way of staying at school. I do research. So Life of Pi, I knew very little about animal behavior and zoobiology. I knew little about survival at sea. There are certain religious faith concerns in Life of Pi from a secular perspective. I knew relatively little about Hinduism, Islam, Christianity. All those fed the story, fed the plot. Once I knew more about survival at sea, it gave me certain problems to be overcome, the finding of fresh water, the finding of food, therefore ways the plot can move forward, because Pi has to overcome those. The very thinking of Life of Pi was a story that, in fact, is two stories. The fact that there are parallel stories allowed me, there's a necessity of having a parallel between the two stories. That advanced the plot, too. If something happened in one story, it had to have a sort of echo in the other. They had to sort of symbolically match. So that, in a sense, gave me plot, or the necessity of plot. Every time I learned something new in terms of survival at sea, let's say, or animal behavior, that nourished the plot, because in a sense it elaborated plot. The tiger in Life of Pi. Once I knew more about tiger behavior, that gave me, there's going to be conflict here with Pi. Well, first of all, there's conflict because he's a tiger anyway, but the tiger needs to survive. But the tiger isn't actually quite as helpless. So in a sense, some ways the tiger could help Pi. So there you start having the elements of things that could happen. I think there are kind of two kinds of writers when it comes to the plot. Those who write more spontaneously, So you kind of just start with a premise or a character, and you just see where the characters will take you. And then there's other people who more carefully craft where it's going, and they plot everything out, and they know where they're going. And I'm more like that. There's no one that's better. It just comes naturally to how people write. It definitely depends on what kind of a writer you are, whether you're a planner or a more spontaneous one. But that will also have your plot develop in a different way. If you're more spontaneous, it can take completely unexpected turns, which could either doom your story. It starts as a Western, turns a romance, becomes a spy novel. That's really hard to pull off. If you overplan, then maybe it feels a bit mechanical. It feels a bit dry, a bit stilted, maybe. Spontaneous writers tend to start really well, but then they peter out, so the ending is, unmemorable. People who plot it out more carefully, I find, usually it starts well enough, ends well enough, but maybe the middle lags a little bit because they have to get from beginning to end. They thought about the beginning, they thought about the end, but they failed to really account for something lively in the middle. So each has its advantage, each has its disadvantages. There's always problems to overcome.